días. Bienvenidos a este webinario organizado por el Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales, COMEXI. Yo soy Héctor Cárdenas, presidente del COMEXI. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. Bem-vindos a todos. Thank you all for joining what I expect will be a timely, substantive, and hopefully forward-looking conversation about U.S. policy in Latin America as it's being reshaped in real time. We're convening at a moment of extraordinary strategic turbulence in the hemisphere. As everybody knows, on January 3rd, the United States carried out a military operation inside Venezuela that resulted in the capture and transfer to U.S. custody of Nicolas Maduro and his wife. And this act has reverberated across the region and the world. In the immediate aftermath, what we've seen is that Venezuela's constitutional succession mechanisms placed Delcy Rodriguez as an interim president. And while she has publicly denounced the U.S. action as illegitimate aggression, she has also communicated a willingness to work with the U.S. government. On the Washington side, the Trump administration has openly said that it intends to run, whatever run means, Venezuela for the foreseeable future. And then there's been a fledgling plan that's been announced by Marco Rubio in three phases that frames U.S. policy in terms of stabilization, recovery, and transition. Simultaneously, President Trump has engaged major oil executives at the White House trying to pitch opportunities in rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector, though public reactions from industry have been cautious and I'd say somewhat tepid about large-scale commitments. Against this backdrop, we know now that Maria Corina Machado, who was originally sidelined in the first, words that came out of Washington, is now scheduled to meet President Trump on January 15th, which raises questions about the role that domestic Venezuelan political figures will play in any transition and the relationship to U.S. policy choices and the risk that external control, has an effect on domestic indigenous political agency. So the situation has gone beyond Venezuela, of course. This administration is provoking debate and sometimes alarm by reintroducing expansionist rhetoric elsewhere, including that of acquiring Greenland, which may underscore a broader shift in how U.S. policymakers are thinking about influence, territory, and strategic advantage in the 21st century. So the question that we're going to be tackling today is not whether these actions were justified. Our panel will assume the intervening facts are established, but rather three key things. What do these moves actually signal about U.S. objectives in the Western Hemisphere? Two, what would success look like over the short, medium, and long term, and how realistic are those outcomes? And how might all of this reshape relations with Latin American governments, influence dynamics with China, and interact with European concerns about international norms and security? I think it's a rare moment when the future of an entire strategic region appears to be in flux. And our goal in the next hour is to dig beneath the headlines and frame what's unfolding in terms of incentives, leverage, legitimacy, and long-term geopolitical consequences. So let me now very briefly introduce our distinguished panel. I'm very happy to welcome Dorothy Kronick, who is professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, whose scholarship on governance and transitions will help clarify the institutional challenges ahead, especially regarding the Venezuelan political situation, the domestic political situation. I also want to welcome John Price, who is Managing Director of America's Market Intelligence, who brings deep experience in political economic risk analysis, over 30 years of work in this area across Latin America. I'm also very happy to welcome Hussein Kalout, former Secretary of Strategic Affairs of Brazil and International Advisory Board member of CEBRI, our partner organization, whose strategic policy expertise adds a crucial regional voice on balance, autonomy, and global competition. And of course, Andrés Rugeles, Vice President of CORI, also a partner institution of COMEXI, who brings practical insight into Colombian and Venezuelan politics and regional security dynamics. We're also I'm very happy to see Chris has joined us. Chris Sabatini is a senior fellow at Chatham House, who's done extensive work in hemispheric strategy and Latin American perspectives, and who will help us, I'm sure, illuminate how the region sees these developments. So without further ado, I'd like to just begin our session today with a lightning round of with a single question to each moderator, so to each participant, so that we can get an idea of how you see what this means, what these events in Venezuela mean, as far as the core doctrine that you think Washington is signaling. So let me start with Hussein on this. What is the core doctrine, and how do you see it from a Brazilian point of view? What's the core doctrine that you think Washington is signaling today?
Well, thank you very much, Héctor, and it's a pleasure to me to be with you all, so distinguished colleague and experts. So from the Brazilian standpoint of view, it's quite likely different than comparatively than other countries across the region. But particularly to us, that implies that the United States is losing power across the world, and particularly trying to assure at least its military domination over the Western Hemisphere, right? When you are powerful and we are building influence, you don't need to use coercion as main instrument of foreign policy. So that this is the Brazilian interpretation on what the Trump administration is doing. Secondly, if we look through a very important thing, a world order based on rules. So nobody here in Brazil believes anymore in a world order based on rules, and that will give China and Russia and other the legitimacy to act, well, the Russian they are doing in Ukraine, but to do it even more in different territories, and also China to do it in East Asia, if they perceive that their geopolitical, geoeconomical, and geomilitary, geostrategic objectives are not are threatened, or if they want to expand their influence. So, U.S., one of the builder of the world order after the Second World War, nowadays is the main structure of this world order that has been organized mainly by the United States. Well, very shortly, the implication for Latin America and particularly to Brazil, I mean, that to Latin America at all, I think in the medium to long term, that will increase Chinese influence in the region.
Let me ask you, Hussein, to hold that thought, because we're going to come back to China.
Okay.
There you hold that thought. Thank you very much for that very, very clear setting. Let me go to a counterpart. Chris, is the U.S. signaling that it is no longer as powerful as it once was? Is that what you take away from this, or is there something else that the U.S. is signaling with this action?
I think the U.S. is signaling right now that it simply doesn't have the patience for diplomatic niceties, for business as it was conducted before, that it didn't accomplish many of the objectives of U.S. foreign policy, even the ones that had to do with democracy and human rights. And quite frankly, the world stood by when they watched the elections being stolen on July 28th, 2024. And no one did anything. Now, let's be honest, Trump didn't intervene in Venezuela for democracy and human rights, although he clearly was being pressed to do so by Marco Rubio. But the truth is that, the U.S., we were to look back 20 years. Let's even take the case of the 2000 elections in Peru with Fujimori, when he attempted to steal the elections. The international community acted in unison. The U.S. was actually very forward-leaning in that. And while it wasn't immediately resolved, there was a reason to do that, but it's because of the diplomatic consensus around the time. That's fragmented. And quite frankly, I think what Trump is responding to is impatience, a certain amount of obviously personal unilateral preference for exercising power. But also what he's responding to is the failure of the region to address what he defines as key national interests. And we saw this in the case of Venezuela. Immigration, we know in 2024, the campaign, he ran against the claims, all wrong, that Trinidad Agua had taken over a city, Aurora, Colorado. He claimed that although it was emptying his prisons and mental institutions to flood the U.S. with criminals. And then later we see this extended to the issue of so-called narco-terrorism. So these are national interests that he feels, quite frankly, the region has not responded sufficiently. And I'm going to say something I may regret, and I'm surprised to hear myself say it. He's partially right on that. That isn't, though, in doing so, he's broken the China. And it goes to the point that you're saying, Hector, about whether this is a new doctrine. I think we first of all have to understand that, yes, it is in the sense that if countries don't respond to what he's defined as U.S. national interest, which, irrespective of the practicality of that, I mean, the idea of launching drones and missiles in Mexico to take out cartels or fentanyl labs actually runs a risk of breaking the China on everything. No, I'm not referring to Hussein's references to China, so don't cut me off, Hector. China in the sort of place setting China is the issue of instability, statelessness, or state collapse in the case of Mexico, and the loss of diplomatic leverage on everything from trade to immigration to drugs that is so key to him. So I'm not saying it will necessarily work, but I think he's expressing that frustration. But I'll end on two particular notes. One is we also have to understand the Venezuela situation as a moment when partially I think he just doubled down. He had no plan. He was led to believe by the opposition, the Venezuelan opposition, as they've done for decades. Oh, don't worry about it. You show some boats, you show some submarines, they're going to get rid of Nicolas Maduro. Easy. You don't need to worry about it. That was the idea, and it didn't happen. And so he consequently got sucked into, because he kept on doubling down on the kinetic action that he had to engage in. And here's the issue, is unfortunately for him, that was a success in his book. He gets to show it on videos, he gets to chest thump, he gets to talk about it. And that's where we get to the moment now where he's going to look more and more as that is a legitimate toolbox for his way to conduct foreign policy in the hemisphere. And that's a risk. And that's where we're saying, we can talk about the discussions of whether Cuba, Colombia, and Mexico are open to similar types of interventions. They're not. They would have far greater consequences. But for Trump right now, that's going to be his go-to tool in the hemisphere, in addition to supporting candidates that he likes. And I'll end on this. In the case of Colombia, this is clearly also a partisan play to try to tilt the field of the elections this year in favor of the Trumpista candidate, Abelardo.
Thank you, Chris. Dorothy, let me go to you and see. We've got two different views here. So I think at the risk of mischaracterizing, Hussein is seeing this as a major change on a geopolitical scale, and as a signal that the U.S. is losing power and is getting worried about it. Chris is really saying this has more to do with domestic politics and the personal dynamics of the Trump administration. What's your take, Dorothy? How do you see it?
Yeah, I think this is, at the most basic level, is a strong signal that Trump is serious about reasserting U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And I think Chris is very right to point out that it's not a one-off, in the sense that it is, while the dynamics of this particular intervention were driven by, as Chris suggested, painting yourself into a corner after the buildup and doubling down, it is also true that this is occurring alongside lots of other types of investments in military bases across the region, in elections, focusing on Panama. And so this is part of a major re-engagement, I think, with the Western Hemisphere and with Latin America, driven, in large part, but not entirely, by Marco Rubio. And so I think it's really important to see it in that context.
Thank you, Dorothy. Let me go to Andrés and just ask you also to reflect on this. What does this say about core doctrine, and how much of a change is this, and what should we read into it? Go ahead, Andrés.
Okay.
And as much as you can engage with what others have said, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Héctor, and I'm pleased to be here and share these ideas with you. Let me start indicating that this is a new world, this is a new hemisphere, and this is a new Trump for the Americas. And we have a global competition of power, US versus China, And the US has launched a new foreign policy towards this hemisphere. And the US considers that the Americas is for the US. That is very, very clear. And the focus is on, I believe, 4 issues: drugs, migration, trade, and obviously energy resources. So the US is back to Latin America. And the strategic point here for them is to fight drugs and to have a new doctrine against drugs. And this new doctrine allows them to go beyond national borders and also to put into question an old concept of sovereignty. So what we have seen in Venezuela is the proof and is the starting point, or is the application of this new doctrine. Whether we like it or not, this is the reality, and this is what's going to be facing in the coming years. The success here, obviously, it was a very successful operation, military operation, that fulfilled its objective to withdraw Maduro from power, something that Latin America was not able to do for many years. And the US did it in one military operation. We like it or not, this is the reality. And let me finish with this. Today, it was presented a poll here in Colombia made by Centro Nacional de Consultoría, which is a very recognized poll center. And it shows that 79%, almost 80% of Venezuelans approve the military operation. So that tells you a lot of what's going on in Venezuela and in the region.
Thank you, Andrés. We'll go back to that, I think, when we discuss what's next internally. But let me go to John and ask you the same question, and maybe react to what you've heard so far as well.
Sure. Well, everyone on this call and hundreds of others around the world are part of a cottage industry that tries to predict the actions and policy movements and what comes next out of the Trump administration. And the reason it's so difficult to do so is because we can't decide whether this is part of a grand strategy and that these actors are playing their role towards this strategy's end, or whether this is very much a sort of improvised, visceral response day to day, where the last influential person that whispers in Trump's ear is the one whose policy gets enunciated in his next press conference. And the press conference that took part on January 3rd, after the attacks, was such a good example of how you had the general speaking in very cold, objective, professional terms that reflected the sort of surgical precision and professionalism of what was really an audacious operation, contrasting with the sort of bumbling, all over the place, hyperbole and irrational thought process of Donald Trump. And so in all of the analysis that I've read subsequently, the one that really stuck out was by a guy named Professor Eduardo Gamara, who teaches at Florida International University. I call him the last political centrist left in Miami. And what he said was, if you really study what's happened, it's like this Venezuela strategy is like a two-headed monster. On the one hand, you've got the Grenells and others who are transactional in their thinking, and they want to make this advantageous commercially, economically for the United States. And then you have Marco Rubio, who at the end of the day, his mission, his legacy will be determined by his ability to unwind the regime in Cuba. And he knows that Cuba will not survive as an economy without a host, economic host. And that economic host went from Russia to Venezuela and has been Venezuela for the last couple decades. And by taking over Venezuela's oil industry and shutting off oil transfers and eventually shutting off the sort of barter exchange that they have with Cuban professionals operating in Venezuela, you will shut off the lifeline economically and energy-wise to Cuba. And so he aspires to be president, and so he would like to see democracy come to Venezuela. He would like to see a regime change in Cuba. Those are two of his most important objectives. But at the same time, you have other people around Trump. There's at least 4 factions, philosophical factions, who influence Trump on a day-to-day basis. And so it's really difficult to predict where these things will go. I do believe that the democracy will come to pass in Venezuela. I don't necessarily buy into a sort of a modern day domino effect, other than Cuba, that this will somehow be a tool that he uses to get his way with Colombia or Brazil or any other leader out there who thinks very differently than Trump. But I do believe that Cuba is seriously threatened by this, not by military intervention, but by economic squeezing. And I do believe that the use of U.S. military force as a way, with the quiet consent of Sheinbaum, to take out certain cartel assets in Mexico. I believe that is a real possibility.
Thank you, John. So I find this conversation already incredibly interesting because it sort of I was cleaning out my documents this weekend, and I came across a little essay that I had written when I was a student. And it was the question that my professor had asked me was, what is history, right? What is it? And I hear in these conversations, I hear the 3 different answers, right? Is it large sort of movements, historical movements, materialistic aspects like Marx and Hegel might have thought about? Is it the great personalities that dominate, or is it just accident and happenstance? And I hear a little bit of everything here in this conversation today. So I want to go back and make sure, maybe dig a little deeper into this, see if we can come to some kind of consensus or real divergence of opinions. I want to go back to what Hussein Kalout was saying. He said very clearly, this is a signal of a long and sort of steady decline in American power. And there are some things that have happened after this that kind of would suggest that President Trump said that he wanted to increase military spending 50%. That would put the U.S. back up to the levels not reached since the Iraq War, so around 5% of GDP. Is that a signal that there's something beyond just the happenstance and the immediate sort of reactions or political needs of the Trump administration, that they actually are seeing something happening on a broader scale that requires the U.S. to be much more focused militarily? I'll go back to Hussein, and maybe we can get a response from one of you in counterpoint.
Wow, a lot to say. So, listen, when I said that the U.S., that is a sign that U.S. is losing influence across the globe, that doesn't mean you are not strong enough to make a military operation such as the one in Venezuela. But that reveals your incapacity, your incapable diplomacy to act and to achieve what you want through pressure, through negotiations, right? So this is first. Of course, the nature of a military operation across the Venezuela, it is very different when, or if the US want to use the same methodology in any other part in Asia. There you have real contenders that they will not allow you to go further in through those objectives. So talking about the characteristic, I think that is not, in my opinion, part of a great grand strategy. I think, in my perception, this is very punctual policy for Latin America. We have to look to the year ahead, how that will be sustained and maintained, either by this government, either by different administrations. That doesn't signalize that United States are back. They are back to Latin America to play an important role, because since the 2000, United States left Latin America and particularly South America, and they left a huge vacuum of power. That vacuum of power was fulfilled by the Chinese, especially, right? And how the Chinese fulfilled the vacuum of power? By investment, by increasing trade, by building infrastructure, right? not through any other aspect. So to emphasize strongly, this is a part of a new doctrine related to Latin America. This is a part of a great grand strategy. I think it's too soon. In my opinion, it's quite punctual, circumstantial, due the fragility of the Venezuelan regime, due Trump personality, and due the the risks that they made and the calculus that this operation could move successfully, because they didn't want to remove the regime, which is quite different than taking Maduro out of power, kidnapping Maduro. And here we don't use the word in Brazil, capture. It's kidnapping, right? So the phrasing of words are very important, right? So kidnapping Maduro, that of course will weaken the regime. Well, in my opinion, if Trump wants to achieve his goals in Venezuela, and his goals are technically and objectively economically based on natural resources control and access, and who to allow to have access and to whom to deny it, right? You need the regime stable. You need the regime as a guarantor for the implementation of these goals. Otherwise, if Venezuela falls in a social crisis, that will take longer to stabilize. The result won't be clear to him. He has only 3 years, and that will become a huge burden for Trump administration, right? So effectively, I don't see how Trump will pressure to remove the regime out of power. He needs the regime at least for a certain period of time, right? And having an autocratic regime, you just go pressure, negotiate, you build. But when you have democratic regime in Venezuela, likely a Democrat president won't agree with what Trump are requesting, which quite assault to the Venezuelan economy and resources. Likely in a democratic order in Venezuela, the government want to put all the treaties and economic accords to the National Assembly, to the House of Representatives or Senate in Venezuela to vote on this project. And likely the result won't be exactly as the United States administration wants. So to achieve your goal, it's better to have an autocratic regime where you could pressure, right? And legitimize this regime in power, other than to have a democratic order. And that has been United States tragic history across the hemisphere, right? So I will stay here.
Thank you, Hussein. And before I ask Andrés to chime in, I just want to remind all of our audience, if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A button, and we'll be happy to take questions as we go along. Andrés, you wanted to react to what Hussein was saying?
Yeah, no, some 3-4 points very quickly. The first one, I do believe that it's too soon to do any forecast regarding Venezuela. And the risk to do all these kind of forecast scenarios is to fail, and we want to do that. And let me start with this couple of reflections. First, don't forget the nature of the regime that has been in Venezuela for more than 25 years. This is a dictatorship. This is a regime linked with illicit drugs, with terrorism, illegal mining, and so on. And the situation of the human rights in Venezuela is unsustainable. So, and the social situation, the economic situation. So Venezuela was put in a risk, I would say that in a kind of failed state, given the nature of this regime that has been in power for the 25 years. With, I will say, with the support of some countries in the region, and also with the support of some allies, extra-regional allies. Second point here, I do believe that the intervention of the military operation in Venezuela, the goal is the change of regime and to move towards democracy. And here, Latin American countries has an enormous responsibility to contribute to the democracy and to the transition in Venezuela. I think this is a task that all of us will have to pursue. And the third point is regarding the presence of the US in the region. It is clear that there are new actors, China, for instance, but don't forget that the US today is the main trading partner of Latin America, while China is the biggest trading partner in South America. This is a reality, okay? And the facts are there. And also the US is the main investor in Latin America. So if we're talking about a retreat of the US in the region, I have my doubts. They have a strong presence. It's a new correlation of forces, but they are here, and I think they are back with another way to do things.
Thank you, Andrés. Let me go to John and just get your point of view about this resource extraction aspect, and how, is that really what's behind U.S. strategy towards Venezuela? And even if it is it viable? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think where oil plays a part strategically is that again, there's a mixture of motives here, but certainly where the one issue or the one enemy, if you like, that unites all political factions in Washington is China. And so the ability of the United States to weaken China's position in Latin America is important, whether it's in their investments in ports, in certain data industries. The Panama Canal has been an obsession of Southern Command now, and China's growing presence as an investor in Panama has been an obsession of the Southern Command for a long time. The U.S. knows strategically that China has one great vulnerability, and that is, even though they have tremendous natural resources themselves, they're not enough to feed their people, they're not enough to feed their industry, and therefore China looks to the rest of the world for resources, and Venezuela is one of those. But again, I think the more important strategy here, or why Venezuela is really related to Cuba more than even China. But in terms of oil, I think that's what it is. In terms of how receptive the industry is, the U.S. industry, there's a clear delineation between the 4 or 5 companies that have operated in Venezuela, either fully operating fields or were developing those fields, and therefore they've already gotten board approval of going into Venezuela. They have people on the ground doing things. They have a level of comfort. Then there are the companies that have yet to go into Venezuela, and for them, including Exxon, who got burned big time, they know it would be a really tough sell to their shareholders and to their boards to go into Venezuela without the sort of legal security and physical security and logistical security that they need to operate their business. That no one is going to make a lot of money in sort of delta increase in the oil industry in Venezuela anytime soon. But those who are on the ground already, as well as service companies who can earn contracts to increase efficiencies and things like that, they can make money in the short term. They're interested. But those who are asked to invest for the first time in Venezuela, that's a tough sell.
Chris, would you like to react also to this, this conversation that we're having about sort of the long term, the role of China, and what is it that the U.S. really wants out of this? Well, it's not really just about Venezuela now. I think at this point we're reaching a stage.
Can I just add
Latin America? Yes, go ahead, John.
Can I just one little point, because I'm actually in Toronto right now, and it's the Canadians are quite concerned about Venezuela because they know that the Athabasca tar sands, the Canadian tar, the Alberta tar sands, they produce the same sort of low-grade heavy crude that is that the entire Gulf states, so the Texan and Louisiana refinery industry was built upon Venezuela crude that was replaced by Canadian crude. Now the Canadians are looking to sell their crude elsewhere to Asia. And so that's part of it as well. There are very politically powerful players amongst those Gulf state refineries who will look to Venezuela to replace Canadian crude.
That's very interesting, and I hadn't heard that brought to the fore. So thanks, John, for doing that. That just complicates the situation even more and creates more actors, right, who are going to be involved in this. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Héctor. First of all, let me apologize for being late. I was just briefing the UK Parliament on Venezuela, which is probably the first time the UK Parliament has ever asked for a briefing on Venezuela, probably since the ICJ's case on demarcating the Guyanese Venezuela border. So I had to comply with that. It's now my new home, London. So first of all, I just want to make one point clear, which is kind of goes to Andres's point about the popularity of the intervention, which is we also have to understand this. We can wring our hands and lament the collapse of the international order or what this means for the international rule of law. The truth is the regional community and the international community abandoned Venezuelan citizens. They've been doing it for 2 decades now. On July 28, 2024, Celso Amorim was in, I'm sorry, Hussein, but Celso Amorim was in Venezuela. He was presented with the actas. What did he do? He left. I'm out of here. The truth is, the moment to act was earlier. And Venezuelan citizens and the international rule of law were not served by regional actors or even by Europe. So we have to understand this first. What Trump did is dramatic, don't get me wrong. But the truth is, there is a need for preemptive diplomacy. And at a time when everyone talks about the global South, the need for global South to reset the international normative system for a multipolar system world, they failed. They failed. So there is a time to actually do this. So on the broader issue of China and Latin America, what to me is curious is now we hear the Trump administration justifying this directly and indirectly because it reduces China's access to Venezuelan oil. Quite frankly, it was a very small percentage. That was really token. And the truth is, it also doesn't work with today's global energy markets or oil markets, quite frankly. I mean, the idea that you would seize Venezuela and have some commanding presence on global oil markets is anachronistic. I mean, it'd be like the UK and the Dutch seizing Ceylon or Sri Lanka and saying, we now have a lock on the spice market. It just doesn't work that way anymore. So there's a certain element of lack of reality, disconnect from reality that's driving this. Because quite frankly, China maybe have many benefits from the US's chest-thumping, testosterone-laden actions right now in the hemisphere that may increase its soft power. We're not really sure what it will mean for its hard power because quite frankly, this really doesn't address a lot of that. So I would say, I agree, this is a different world. We need to worry about the unshackled US policy from international law, but we also need to understand this is a time, can be a positive time, quite frankly, for the international community that's not Trump to step up and start to defend the very rights. I mean, I'll just add one more thing on this. No one tried, we saw over 6 months, Donald Trump building up weaponry off the coast of Venezuela. No one, except for Lula, which no one was going to buy it because Celso Amorim had already walked out on Venezuelan citizens, no one took that offer up. 6 months of a buildup, something could have been done. There could have been a vote in the UN. Nothing was done. So, quite frankly, I think this is a clarion call to the international community to do much more than stand up preemptively to defend these rights and not sit around afterwards and bitch and moan. Excuse my language.
So one of the things that we've heard a lot, I mean, mostly from Latin America and other countries, is this idea of the defense of the principle of sovereignty. But of course, we have to remember that international law is not just the principle of sovereignty; it's also self-determination. It's also respect for human rights, etc. And so where are those in the discussion? Dorothy, I'd like to turn to you now, and maybe you can address some of the things that have been said. Especially, Andrés mentioned that he does think that there will be a transition to democracy, and that even if it might not have been top of mind, it's. Several of you have said, Marco Rubio, on the Marco Rubio side, that is an intent, a goal. So if there is such a thing, if there is an intent to have a transition to democracy, how does that play out? And we have a question from the audience that says, what institutions have to be built in order to get that transition period to work?
Great, thanks. Well, let me address that first. Like, what would a path to transition look like? And then I want to come back to this question that both Andres and Chris have touched on of popular support or lack thereof for this intervention within Venezuela. So in terms of a path to transition to democracy, I agree that it is possible, and I'm not willing to let go of that optimism, despite the fact that Trump didn't even mention democracy in his press conference on the morning of the intervention, despite the fact that in his interview the next day, Rubio, when asked about a timeline for elections, just looks at the journalist and says, elections, and then talks about how that's really premature, despite the fact that we haven't heard anything from Trump or Rubio really about these timelines, about the institutions, et cetera. And all of that said, I agree. I'm not willing to rule this out. What might it look like? How could potentially the US use this new leverage to pave a path towards that? I think some kind of first order things would be getting opposition representation on the Supreme Court, getting opposition representation on the Electoral Council, getting opposition representation in the cabinet. All of these things, I think, are would work toward what political scientists call like lowering the stakes of power and making it so that elections are less existential. You can lose an election and function as the political opposition. And so all of this type of incremental institutional reform is not in the spirit of let's erase Chavismo from the face of the earth, or, let's, on the Chavista side, like eliminate, ban opposition candidates, but rather in the spirit of having some sort of power sharing, as unlikely as that may sound. I'm kind of not willing to give that up. And I think that would then pave the way for elections that could be respected and enforced, unlike the election last year, which, as we've all said, but just to remind everyone attending, the opposition won and then Maduro stole. So that I think is that what we're hearing from Washington is at the top of the agenda? No, but like Andres and Chris, I can't let go of like some optimism that could happen. And certainly it is possible. Now, I want to come back to this issue of public opinion. So we saw, I would be very cautious. There's a lot of kind of surveys floating around, many of which are online surveys. And I think we really need to not put too much emphasis on numbers from these online surveys, because there is so much selection in who's online and who's choosing to answer these questions. And the last kind of on the ground survey that we saw in Venezuela was in November by Data Analysis, that had still 1 year after the election, more than a year after the election, very strong support for Maria Corina Machado, near, a vast majority of people obviously rejecting Maduro and the government, and yet 55% of people opposing the idea of U.S. military intervention, and almost a quarter, a little less than a quarter, expressing support. Now, we don't have like minute by minute polls from Saturday, but let me tell you what I'm hearing and my feeling about how public opinion has evolved on this, just from a qualitative sense of WhatsApp groups and, without seeing any polling numbers. I sensed tremendous amount of enthusiasm in the hours after it was announced that Maduro was removed. And of course, I acknowledge there remain many people in Venezuela who support the government, et cetera, but obviously majority do not. And so I was hearing a lot of Somos Libre, that kind of enthusiasm. And then followed by a lot of disappointment when it was revealed that Delcy will be left in charge. And a lot of, I think, people who are in politics, people on this panel or have been following closely, anticipated that maybe, this was a possible outcome, that Trump could work with Delcy, as improbable as that might seem, on the face of it. But I think my friends who are not involved in politics or weren't following as closely, this just seemed so improbable, and there's tremendous disappointment, even though, again, we might say the transition to democracy has to be through this institutional reform. The idea of just installing Edmundo Gonzalez on day one was not practical, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean that everyone watching didn't have, some expectation of that and some disappointment at the initial announcement.
Thank you, Dorothy. Chris, and then Hussein.
I would just like to actually echo what Dorothy said, because exactly what I was saying about the need for the international community to step up and engage in preemptive diplomacy to defend UN-sanctioned rights of self-determination and human rights. This is a moment when the international community can play a constructive role again. And I share Dorothy's optimism, or at least a little shred of optimism, because the truth is, this is what it is. Let's make the best of it. We can revisit, we can relitigate, we can do all that stuff. But part of the way that the international community can now play a more positive role is doing exactly what Dorothy was saying. Because let's be honest, Trump isn't going to do it. Marco Rubio only has a very thin space to do it within the administration, is to imagine a group of organizations, UN, OAS, neighbor countries, the EU, to say, look, what's done is done, lamentably perhaps, but this should be a plan for democratization, and lay out what benchmarks. I think the Trump administration would resist any benchmarks or any timeline or deadlines. But I think in terms of articulating, basically what this could do to make a smoother path and a more consensus-oriented and less polarizing path to democracy, I actually think that's a very positive role for the international community that it can play now, where it hadn't in the past.
Thank you, Chris. Hussein, and then John.
Well, I just want to build up on some points. They are very, very important. Chris mentioned Salsa and Brazil. And I have to tell you that I agree that Brazil has played wrongly in Venezuela. I am one
Thanks,
of
Hussein.
those...
I didn't want to offend you. Thanks.
No, you didn't offend me. I mean, I agree that the Brazilian foreign policy that has been pursued toward Venezuela in the beginning of the Lula's government was miscalculated, right? Miscalculated. They tried to fix the position where Maduro stole the election and when Brazil decided to not recognize Maduro's government. But beforehand, I think the strategy from the beginning was wrong. They conceded Maduro a lot of legitimacy, and they thought that they could moderate Maduro. They could moderate Maduro. They could convince Maduro to allow the realization or the organization of the free and transparent elections. And they thought perhaps that Maduro will, under a regional pressure, he will accept to at least to run the opposition or the different opponent to run in the election. But that has been a failed strategy in my personal opinion. But regardless to that, I want to point out important things that has been brought by Héctor about self-determination and sovereignty. And I think the matter that the United States have a great or strong or economic ties with Latin American state that doesn't give the right to the United States to interfere through coercion militarily in some region, in some countries, right? So Latin America is not different than South America, right? It is the same, except geographically, when we discuss South America, geographically is quite far, but in terms of identity, Latin American identity, South America is part of the Latin American identity. That said, today, if you look toward the economies in South America, they are much, except Mexico, of course, up there, they are much huge, massively huge in comparison than the other countries across the region, right? Because if you look at Central America and some Caribbean states, you cannot compare them to the Colombian, Brazilian, Argentinian, Peruvian, and so on, all together, right? And I want to just conclude it on China on that, and especially on defense budget on that in South America. I think it will be very hard to United States to reverse Chinese influence in South America, especially in Brazil, but it will be impossible to reverse it. And I would say in Argentina. Okay. And I would say in somehow in Peru, because when the United States start to threaten Chinese direct investment in South America, as the port of Shanghai there in Peru, then you will have a cross retaliation in Asia. And here, where is the limit to balance the situation, right? Because the Chinese not gonna step silent. And from our standpoint of view, Brazilian, we don't need this clash to be amplified in South America. Cross retaliation doesn't help to stabilize the region. Here, I agree there's a consensus that Maduro is not, that Maduro government is not legitimate. It's a regime, an autocratic dictatorial regime, but that doesn't give the United States the legality to perpetrate a military action, because then the Chinese will allegate the same, right, in other region and perhaps even across. I don't know if you know, Chinese has a military advanced post in southern Argentina that has been accepted and negotiated during Fernandez's government. Okay, so we don't want to see like the Chinese establishing a base or amplifying military presence even in southern Argentina, as we don't want to see U.S. military intervention in North South America, right? So this is a very tricky situation, and especially small countries in South America or perhaps in Latin America, then they will, in the long term, medium long term, they will go and ask for Chinese protection when they do not trust in the United States foreign policy as a foreign policy based on cooperation and stability and prosperity and sharing values, right? The most concerned countries in the region about Venezuela, about the US military action, they are not the autocratic states. They are exactly the democratic states in the region, right? So concluding, and then, I mean, talking about defense budget, here in Brazil, and I worked as Secretary for Strategic, I served as Secretary for Strategic Affairs. The military regime, you know, during between the like 50s, 60s, and even till the 80s, we had a very sophisticated nuclear program for military purposes, right? And then we decided to renounce on the military capability. But Brazil is capable to move toward that because we have all the knowledge, all the capacity, all the natural resources to build a non-conventional military power in less than a year. I would say in 6 months. So to conclude, I just want to finish that. Yeah. So, and here there are some voices in Brazil, they want to go back to that time, which a lot of sectors in the country are against. And here within the military prospect in Brazil, you have two groups, the hardliner who actually want to go back in time to the 60s and 70s in terms of how they perceive their military projection. And you have the other group that they are against the weaponization of the army. So no matter what, from now beyond, the military operation united both spectrum. And definitely from now beyond, the military will pressure the Congress, the private sector, whomever, to expand their budget. And we need here in Brazil much more hospitals, schools, etc., railroads, etc., to make the economy growing, not to acquire a military arsenal for, for nothing. But now the threat, it is on our border as a military intervention. And any excuse, you can frame any narrative you wanted, any narrative, when you want to accomplish a military objective.
Thank you, Hussein. So that's a very scary thought that we might have an arms race within Latin America, which was perhaps the only continent that had been kept away from that, at least in terms of interstate conflict over the past few years. So we have just a few minutes, so I want to just ask everybody just have closing thoughts. Please keep it very short, 1 minute maximum. And we'll start with Andrés, and then Dorothy, and then Chris. And I'm afraid our friend John had to leave because he had a previous engagement that he couldn't miss. So closing thoughts, Andrés.
Thank you, Héctor. Closing remarks or closing thoughts. I think the transition in Venezuela is not going to be as fast or as soon, it's not going to happen as soon as we wish. It will be a long process, a bumpy process, and we have to manage that. Second point here is that definitely the political system in Venezuela has to be reset after these 25 years of dictatorship. And the reset means to build new institutions, to have the separation of powers, and definitely to have the justice have to work in Venezuela. And we have to keep in mind that we have to go beyond the obsession with elections. I mean, the elections are a mean, but it's not the goal in this case. The goal is the reconstruction, the comprehensive reconstruction of Venezuela. And let me finish with this. I think the process has to be led by Venezuelans. It's not by external actors. Are the Venezuelans and the opposition in Venezuela building a broad consensus, the ones who have to be in charge of rebuilding the system and to be leading the transition with the support of Latin American countries and the international community. That's it, Héctor.
Thank you, Andrés. Dorothy, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just add one more comment about Brazil. There's been a lot of talk about the international community, and I think an important question is what could Brazil have done, right? Not what type of reform should they be supporting, et cetera, but what could Brazil or Colombia have done last year? And one thing that I would point to is just Lula specifically could have recognized Edmundo González as the winner of the election, not as the president of Venezuela, as was done with Guaido, crazily, right, in 2019, but just recognize. And instead, there was, I agree with Chris and Hussein, now there's a very soft message about we want to see more evidence and we need, and no, Edmundo won that election, and I think that Brazil could have recognized that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dorothy. Chris, last
So
word.
thank you. Don't never give me the last word, but I appreciate it. First of all, to actually build on what Dorothy just said, I mean, it's kind of ironic that Lula was actually returned to office in large part because of international advocacy against Jair Bolsonaro, who clearly was trying to steal the elections. So then they turn around and abandon that very principle that Lula himself has benefited from. And I don't want to pile on, sorry, Hussein, Brazil, you're not a Brazilian representative here, but I just feel like I do. So, but moving on, I think, look, a couple of things. First of all, I hope this works. All things considered, you know, it would be a terrible precedent if it does, but the truth is Venezuelans need this to work, and I agree, I understand. The question is what the international community can do to try to help that process along and not leave it only to the Trump administration, which has a very short attention span and has oftentimes falls victim to, let's just say, optimism, excessive optimism. And there's a lot to do. And so, yes, we need to continue to relitigate this and everything that happened, but we also need, as sort of the intellectual community and policymaking community, to start to articulate what would make this work, given what it is. And that means, in some cases, swallowing some very real partisan antipathy and doubt. But I think this is the way it's going to be. And then to the point about China and the global affairs, I think it also is incumbent now for the world and others to start to say, well, we understand how we got to here, but we need to understand now how to reform the international system to prevent such flagrant and to ensure less inertia to avoid such flagrant violations of the international law in the future.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Hussein. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, John, who had to leave us prematurely. Thanks all of you for participating in this webinar. I think we covered a lot of material in a very short time. I take away a few things. I don't think we still know what's the final play here from the U.S. side, whether it really is part of a grand strategy or if it's just domestic political considerations or opportunism and just an opportunistic grab for a win that people identified as possible. It seems that I think there's a fairly broad consensus among our group that it makes sense, given what has happened, to really push and make a concerted international effort to help along the process of transition to democracy in Venezuela, and that would really be at least a silver lining in this very cloudy situation that we're engaged with. And thirdly, that we have to think of this as one important moment in the reconstruction of our world, of our global rules-based system, perhaps under some different rules, and maybe we have to rethink some of that as we go along. So thanks everybody for participating. Thank you to our audience for your participation as well. And I just want to remind you that we're going to have a webinar on Friday, also on Venezuela, but looking at Venezuela and Mexico and what does the Venezuela situation imply for Mexico's relationship with the United States. And we're doing that with UCSD and with Harvard on Friday at 11 a.m. Mexico City time. So please join us on Friday as well as we take a different look at this and look at it from much more from the U.S.-Mexico perspective. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Alejandra, and everyone else. Great panel. Appreciate it.